Social contract theory. We begin a discussion of social contract theory by looking at the early work of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes' famous quote focused on what would happen if there was a situation in which there was no interference of laws and that humans feared death every day from other humans. He called this the war of all against all. There's a familiar quote that he makes, which is, in this predicament, this imaginary natural state, humans would live in continual fear and danger of violent death. He writes, the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not a very optimistic view of humankind. So Hobbes then asks, how do humans escape this predicament? He suggests that the way we do this is to put all the power and strength together on a grouping of people, and that this grouping requires a social contract where everyone keeps their promises and act in a trustworthy manner, because they know to defect from these promises there'll be punishment from some sovereign or some sovereign power, some overriding political government power. To Hobbes, it is only by vesting all political power in the hands of one political body that humans can live a peaceful life, and it will not regress to a war of all against all. This theory stood out as highly radical and unique because it seemed to suggest that government could be absolute, and it seemed to suggest that by giving all power to government, people could recognize that sovereign not only makes the law, but it itself is above the law and carries out punishments for violations. Hobbes stated that in order for society to function, there had to be equality of need, such as covering basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter. The distribution of resources, that resources could be scarce, so anyone hoarding the resources would upset the balance of social progress. That there could be equality of power in a competitive world, and that there could be altruism in a limited sense, in that people are driven by self-interest, but if this self-interest is limited by some sort of social contract where everyone agrees on the rules, then people will live a moral life and society will function. According to Hobbes, this political function suggests that humans were naturally self-interested, but they were also rational, that they would choose to submit to a higher authority in the government or the sovereign in order to be able to live in a civil society, which is conducive not only to the function of a civil society, but to the function of their own self-interest. As Hobbes talks about the state of nature, this hypothetical state, Hobbes notices that individual humans could be strong, possess weapons, and be able to defend themselves, but even the strongest person could be killed in their sleep, and the limited resources could be consumed by the few and not distributed. In this hypothetical state of nature, people would regress to always fearing that they would lose their life to other people. So there's an underlying assumption that in order to not regress to a state of nature, to escape this state of nature, and to create a civil society, each human would be willing to pursue peace as long as others were willing to do the same. That is, people would engage in the social contract as long as other people engaged in the social contract and pursued peace. In other words, to escape the state of nature, everyone agrees to live under common laws. And there's an enforcement mechanism for the social contract when people violate laws or violate the social norms and do whatever they please. Hobbes also referred to a concept called the voice of duty, which refers to the restriction of one's impulse for the benefit of everyone. In other words, in our society, there are things that we may want to do, but we choose not to because we realize that by not robbing, stealing, committing crimes, the benefit of everyone is we live in a moral society. Hobbes wrote, "Morality is the set of rules governing behavior that rational people will accept, on the condition that others accept them as well." So to Hobbes, moral philosophy included both the individual emphasis on morality as well as the role of government or the group level. This has particular interest for criminal justice. One of the existing examples that you'll find in a lot of undergraduate criminal justice classes, also used in business classes, sociology, and other different fields of study, is the prisoner's dilemma. This is the idea that two prisoners have been convicted or accused of a crime and they're both incarcerated. The assumption is they're both in solitary confinement, so they cannot communicate with each other. If both prisoners confess to the crime, then both will go to jail for 5 years. If, however, they both keep quiet, they will both go to jail for 1 year. If one confesses and the other keeps quiet, then the person who confesses will go to jail for 10 years and the other person will go free. The outcomes of the prisoner dilemma suggests that there are different outcomes for rational decision making. One interesting aspect of it is that in the criminal justice system, this is essentially the system because it bases itself on plea bargains. The prisoner's dilemma is also used in game theory, psychology, the study of animals, sports, politics. In sports, for example, the prisoner's dilemma has been applied to athletes who cheat using performance-enhancing drugs as opposed to those who don't. And the prisoner's dilemma, for purposes of this lecture, shows the benefits of the social contract. That is, social cooperation versus following individual self-interest. According to the prisoner's dilemma, there are really four ways that you can approach the problem if you're placed in one of those roles as a prisoner. The best outcome is that if you consider yourself a free rider, and you are selfish and others are benevolent. So if the other person confesses and you get off free, that's the best outcome in terms of your individual self-interest. Number two is called benevolent. Everyone is benevolent. As a result, everyone confesses. The first one and two, free rider and benevolent, are seen to be the best outcomes in terms of the social contract and the way a civil society would occur. Number three, the state of nature. In this regard, everyone is selfish. This is seen as a much lower step than option two, because everyone's out for themselves, and the outcome is the third best outcome, or the second to the worst outcome. And the worst possible outcome in the prisoner's dilemma is what they call the sucker's payoff, when you're benevolent and others are selfish. So if you were to confess and receive 10 years, the other person would go free. Your benevolence would get you 10 years in prison, the other person will get 0, and this is the worst possible outcome. Using this simple approach, it's seen the emphasis is placed on the social contract working with options 1 and 2, which means that one person can follow their self-interest as long as we're all benevolent, or we can follow the social contract when we can all be benevolent. The next moral theorist and philosopher who dealt with the social contract is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he starts with the assumption that law and the political order are not natural or innate human issues, but rather they are human creations. As a result, there are different ways that they can be conducted, and better and worse ways. According to Locke, if the government fails to secure the rights of the people, or according to Rousseau, if they fail to satisfy the best interest of society, or what's called the general will, then, according to Locke and Rousseau, the government can be removed by votes, protests, or even violence. This is an approach to suggesting that if the social contract is not followed, then there is inherent mechanisms to which governments can be removed and other governments installed. In 1762, Rousseau wrote of the social contract, and in this book he's quoted as saying, "Men are born free, yet everywhere they are in chains." There's a myriad of ways in which Rousseau says there are chains in a civil society. And he says these chains suppress the natural birthright of humans to physical freedom. He states that the civil society does nothing to enforce the equality and individual liberty that were promised to humans when they entered into the society. For Rousseau, the only legitimate political authority is the authority consented to by all people who have agreed to such government by entering into the social contract for the sake of their mutual preservation. According to Rousseau, the collective grouping of all people who by their consent enter into a civil society is called the sovereign. The sovereign is the collective grouping of the people and ideas. And this sovereign may be thought of, metaphorically at least, as an individual person with a unified will. That is, the sovereign as a group of people can be thought as one person with a united perspective and will. This is important, for while actual individuals may naturally hold different opinions and wants and desires according to their individual circumstances, the sovereign as a whole expresses the general will of all people. Rousseau defines this general will as the collective need of all to provide the common good for all. So there was a natural emphasis on the equality of people and the role of freedom. To Rousseau, government carries out the function of upholding laws. That is the government's responsibility in the social contract. There is likely to be friction on a number of issues between the people's will, the sovereign, and the government's desires. Therefore, openness, transparency, and freedom is required through such mechanisms as public meetings, votes, and these are crucial mechanisms in order to reduce this freedom. One interesting point that Rousseau points out is that he opposes the idea that monarchies, that is kings and queens, were divinely empowered to legislate. To Rousseau, only people and the grouping of people and the general will of people have that all-powerful right to engage in the social contract and to put their ideas and wants forward. The next social contract theory worthy of discussion is John Locke. In 1689, he wrote 2 treatises of government. This was a very unique and radical work. So it was published originally anonymously because it had some very radical ideas. In the second treatise, Locke outlines a theory of civil society. He begins by describing the state of nature, a perspective that he sees much more stable than Hobbes' state of nature, in which there is a war of every man against every man. Here Locke states that his state of nature, he sees things as more stable, and that all humans are created equal in the state of nature by God. From here he goes on to explain the hypothetical rise of property and civilization over time. In the process, Locke explains that the only legitimate government are those that have the consent of the people. Therefore, any government that rules without the consent of the people can, in theory, be overthrown. So we see the important historical rise of property, private property in particular, and the resulting response from government and their responsibility to the social contract. As mentioned, Locke talks about the state of nature and reaffirms Hobbes' idea that it is best to avoid the state of nature that often occurs. This has to happen in order to protect private property, and people enter into this in a civil or political society. He says nobody in the natural state has the political power to tell others what to do. However, everybody has the right to pronounce justice and administer punishment for breaches of the natural law. That is why people in general society are put on court cases as jurors and engage in the distribution of justice in other manners. To Locke, humans are not free to do whatever they please. A quote from Locke is, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone, and reason, which is the law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." So there are certain inherent underlying principles in the social contract that Locke says must be followed. Once again, Locke talks about private property, and he uses the term life, liberty, and estate. By saying that political society was established for the better protection of property, he claims that it serves the private and non-political interests of the members of society. It does not promote some good that can be realized only in a community with others, such as virtue. In this sense, every human owns their own labor. At minimum, you own your own labor regardless of what property or other finances you might have. To deny an individual labor would be to make that person a slave. One can therefore take items from the common good by mixing one's labor with them, but you can't actually take away somebody's labor. Perhaps most controversial is Locke's idea about the right of revolution. To Locke, under natural law, all people have the right to life, liberty, and estate, which is an aspect of the social contract. And if these rights were violated, then the social contract was void. The people could instigate a revolution in response to a failure of the social contract to replace that government with one that better serves the interests of the citizens. As you can imagine, this is a revolutionary idea in this time frame. In some cases, Locke even deemed revolution a moral obligation, as it was a safeguard against tyranny. So when looking over these early writers of Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Hobbes, one can see what we call contractarians, another word for social contract theorists, that they argue for a social set of social rules, laws, etc., that can be rationally justified. These social rules extend from the legal to include political and also individual morality. We now move to a more recent social contract theorist, John Rawls, who is often seen as one of the founders of modern-day liberalism. In 1972, Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice, and this reinvigorated the social contract theory. To Rawls, people have the capacity to reason from a universal viewpoint. He begins with this idea. Rawls presents a very interesting idea, which he calls the veil of ignorance. He states that from the veil of ignorance, which is an abstract version of the state of nature, we can regress to an original position. We can recognize in a modern-day world the inequality that often arises from the possession of private property. And we can also recognize that modern-day governments often have trouble maintaining equality. The social contract can skew itself from the will of the people to become the interests of the rich and the powerful. And indeed, when we look at issues of economic inequality, it's quite interesting that one of the most common and replicated relationships has to do with economic inequality. Interestingly, this is different from poverty. It's more the distribution between the wealthy and the poor in society, and the hoarding of economics by the few members of a society. Of note, a number of health and social problems are directly linked to economic inequality. We can see such things as heart disease, cancer, a range of physical health issues, even being overweight. We can also see social problems such as crime, mental illness. These all have this kind of linear pattern that you see in this table, in this graph, sorry, that show countries that have more inequality tend to attract more of these social and health problems. So to Rawls, this concept of the veil of ignorance asks the reader to place himself in a hypothetical situation, one in which they have no knowledge of a race, gender, socioeconomic, a skill set, a mental approach, a mental illness, none of those things. It's literally the concept of putting a veil over your head and not knowing what member of society you are or what your current standing is. To Rawls, this was the best approach to choose principles for a just society. That is, placed in the position that could potentially be the bottom of the barrel in terms of having no money, few skills, few opportunities. If everyone places themselves in that position at minimum, or in any other position through society, then everyone can make equally rational choices as part of the social contract. Rawls called this justice as fairness, and he perceived this as a moral position for a just society. According to Rawls, the first principle was the distribution of civil liberties and socio-economic goods. He said with as much liberty as possible, the equal distribution of goods was something that was morally supported through the social contract theory. And he found that civil liberties themselves were fundamental to any modern day society. The second principle, according to Rawls, he called the difference principle, and he explained that this it was not a cry for communism, because economic inequalities could be accepted when using the veil of ignorance. However, they had to be justified when the least advantage is better off than any other alternative. So the least advantaged member of society is still in a state better off when compared to the alternative. The veil of ignorance said we would accept this principle if we were placed in the position of being this least advantaged person. So inequalities were acceptable when there was no other option. A few modern social contract theorists, David Guthrie wrote Morals by Agreement in 1986, and this book supports Hobbes and suggests that morality can be found on agreements between self-interest yet rational persons. He called people in society individual Robinson Crusoes and suggested that we enter into agreements and cooperation for our own self-interest, that self-interest and group interest can often coincide. Guthrie refers to the prisoner's dilemma, and he actually suggests that people do in fact do better when pursuing self-interest rather than looking strictly for cooperation. He did, however, can call this approach constrained maximizers, not straightforward maximizers, so there's some limitations to this. And there's also rationality when pursuing self-interest in this cooperative context, which is another way of saying morals by agreement. So what are the strengths of social contract theory? Well, the first strength is that it is intuitive and observable. We live by the social contract theory every day. There's probably a number of things that you wish to do every day but you don't on the basis that other people also don't do those things. If other people decided to start doing whatever they wanted, you would be placed in the prisoner's dilemma when you would have to start doing whatever you wanted. Social contract theory suggests what moral rules we should follow and how those rules are justified. So it prevents a very clear set of rules, and in some cases laws, that can be easy to follow. And you see the next point, there's a mutual benefit for following them and a fear of punishment for not following them. So it's in many cases a codified set of laws or rules that we can indeed follow, but we can also know ahead of time what happens if we don't follow it. A good way of thinking about this is to compare it to a monarchy, where, let's say in English time, during the monarchy, if you stole a sheep from a king or a queen's property, there was capricious responses with punishment, and one person may receive minimal punishment and the next person may receive the death penalty for stealing a sheep. The social contract theory rejects this approach because the punishments and the laws and the rules are actually written down so everyone has a clear idea of the rules that underlie social contract theory. Social contract theory also indicates when it's rational to break the rules, and it suggests that we agree to obey the rules on the condition that others will as well. Weaknesses. Does social contract theory adequately account for our ordinary sense of morality? It seems to define goodness in egotistical or self-centered terms, and then asks us how to be strategic about our goals. So there is some questioning about, do in fact our individual selfish goals coincide with the best outcomes at the group level? And two, does social contract theory include vulnerable humans, such as the mentally ill, babies, other groups that can't necessarily rationalize their own self-interest, the severely mentally retarded, for example, as well as non-human animals? Are they accounted for in the social contract? They can't rationalize and make a contract. Babies are born into the social contract. They don't make an agreement. And they also can't retaliate us for violations of the social contract. There are some other theories in moral philosophy that do include the perspectives of vulnerable humans and animals. So one final thought is this funny little internet meme that says the social contract is a vague notion to which no one has explicitly agreed, but that supposedly authorize a certain class of people to steal, imprison, and kill in order to benefit the greater good, however they define it. So a rather sarcastic viewpoint here, but it's rather funny.